Good afternoon and welcome. I am Jaime Monjor, International Outreach Officer at the National Institute for Holocaust Documentation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is an honor for me to be here and for the museum to be presenting today's program, Preserving Holocaust History Through Artifacts, Archives, and Research, in partnership with the Generations After organization. I would like to acknowledge Anat Bar-Cohen, President of the Generations After, Vice President Dina Hirsch, and Program Committee Chairs Ruth Cummings and Micheline Amir, who is also our former colleague and current museum volunteer. Thank you. The museum's National Institute for Holocaust Documentation is in a race against time to rescue the evidence of the Holocaust from Jewish and non-Jewish victims, survivors, and eyewitnesses. The National Institute for Holocaust Documentation is responsible for building, preserving, and making accessible America's collection of record, one of the world's foremost collections of materials and documentation on the Holocaust. We depend on artifacts, documents, photographs, films, music, and oral testimonies to document the events of the Holocaust and understand the relevance of this history in our own time. We need to rescue these materials before it is too late and the eyewitness generations are no longer with us. We are committed to document the atrocities implemented by the Nazis and their collaborators by acquiring, preserving, and making this evidence accessible to everyone. This evidence also supports the museum's wide-ranging efforts in the areas of research, exhibitions, publications, education, and commemoration, and should be preserved for future generations to come. Together, we will continue building the collection of record on the Holocaust, making it accessible anywhere, anytime, to ensure we can teach this history with authenticity and relevance to every new generation. Thank you. Before we continue, a few housekeeping notes. We ask for your forgiveness if there are technical difficulties. This is a live program and anything can happen. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom center of your screen to type in your question at any time throughout the program. Your questions will not appear on the main screen and the chat function is disabled. We will get as many questions as possible in our allotted time. This gathering is being offered in closed captioning, and if you would like to utilize that feature, please press the CC button towards the bottom right to your screen. And now it is a pleasure to introduce you Anat Bar-Cohen, President of the Generation Afters, who will offer brief remarks and introduce our speaker. Anat?
Thank you very much, Jaime. And I would like to welcome everyone also to this fascinating event that brings together two natural worlds, the world of the children of Holocaust survivors and the world that works to preserve the memories and artifacts of our families and their communities lost in the Shoah. We know that you will find this afternoon's program, Preserving Holocaust History, entirely engrossing. As Jaime mentioned, I'm Anat Bar-Cohen, president of the Washington area-based Generations After, an organization founded in 1979. Generations After is a network of survivors and descendants of the Holocaust linked together by the common goals of preserving and honoring our historical legacy and providing support to our community, particularly survivors, as we tackle issues of mutual significance. Over these past 2 years, our specific foci have been on the continuing efforts to stem rising anti-Semitism in this country and abroad, and to discover, document, and memorialize the stories of our families and their communities. To accomplish these goals, we have presented relevant programs, collaborated with other groups that share our focus, initiated efforts such as our memoir writing groups, and worked with the museum and its vast resources. Almost all of us have grown up feeling the loss of missing family members, the sadness of knowing them only through stories or precious black and white photos, or of bearing their names and being told we resemble them. For us, things like digitizing and being able to access the 17-mile-long Arelson archive or navigating the Yiskor books of our family's towns have been indescribably important experiences. In the next hour, you will hear exactly how the museum does its work of sharing archives, records, files, databases, and artifacts, and how you can receive one-on-one consultations to research information about your very own family. Generations After welcomes anyone with a family connection to the Shoah, and we invite you to visit our website, shown on the screen, genafterdc.com, for more information. So while we are still meeting virtually, or when we get to meet in person, we hope to see you at our next book or writers group, our social gatherings for Shabbat dinners, Hanukkah, or at our garden party, or at Yamei Shoah commemorations, at our upcoming Survivor Cookbook program for Shavuot, or the film viewing and discussion of Winter Journey based on a book about the ship, the St. Louis, with its author and filmmakers. And now, let me thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, its International Outreach Officer, Jaime Munoz, and this whole entire staff who worked really diligently and incredibly professionally with our speakers to organize today's events. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speakers. Susan Goldstein Snyder is a curator and joined the staff of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1991, 2 years before the museum opened. She has acquired thousands of artifacts, documents, and photographs for the permanent collection. She grew up in the Chicago area, has a BA from the University of Kansas and an MA from the City University of New York at City College. Jude C. Richter received his PhD in Russian history from Indiana University. From 2002 through 2006, he worked for the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, conducting research in the collections of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to document Holocaust survivors' claims. He's currently a research and reference specialist in the museum's Survivors and Victims Resource Center. And now I'm truly pleased to hand it over to Susan Snyder to get the program started. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Thank you, Anat. It's really been a pleasure to be working on this program with your organization. Thank you for having us. I'm going to start in 1989, when the project team was working in Poland and looking at historic sites in an effort to greater understand how they would shape the exhibition in the future United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This railcar was offered to the team by the Institute of National Remembrance Poland. It was used as a piece of evidence in a war crime trial, and the Institute offered the railcar in which Jews were moved from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka killing center in Poland. With so many testimonies from Jewish victims that described the horrific trip to the death camps by railcar, the team viewed this as an important object to add to the exhibition. This photograph was taken in 1991 as the railcar was actually being lowered into the partially constructed museum. Jumping ahead 30 years, the museum has been open for 27 of them, and our collections have grown exponentially. Our former offsite collections facility was retrofitted corporate real estate, never intended to be a permanent solution to housing and conserving the greatest assets we have, our collections. The David and Fella Chappelle Family Collections Conservation and Research Center is a state-of-the-art facility with highly specialized laboratories and climate-controlled environments where a wide variety of media are treated and preserved. It allows for acquisitions, education, and scholarship to ensure that future generations will continue to honor the memory of Holocaust victims and learn from their history to build a better future. Let's look at just a few of the collections in our repository. Some we acquired easily and some took years to acquire. So I have a few examples. Born in 1919 in Italy, Primo Levi was a Jewish chemist who in 1943 joined partisans in the Italian mountains. He was arrested late 1943 on false papers, but admitted that he was Jewish rather than be shot as a partisan. He was deported eventually to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where in January 1945, he was liberated by the Russians. In an oral testimony we have from Primo Levi, he described that one arrived at Auschwitz hoping to find camaraderie amongst the prisoners. This was not to be. He found a completely different kind of society. Everybody was the enemy of the other. Everybody had to fight this battle alone. That upon entering the camp, if a prisoner did not survive the initial shock, they lost all hope and quote unquote drowned. His well-known biography, Survival at Auschwitz, was published based on a manuscript he wrote entitled, If This Is a Man, which documents his experiences in Auschwitz. In 2018, my colleague received a phone call from two women, Levy's cousins, who wanted to donate the manuscript. The museum is honored to house the manuscript, which, as you can see here, even contains Levy's edits. In it, he writes the following: "We say hunger, we say tiredness, fear, pain. We say winter, and they are different things. They are free words created and used by free men who lived in comfort and suffering in their homes. If the lagers, camps, had lasted longer, a new harsh language would have been born." In 1944, Priska Berger, pregnant, was deported to Auschwitz. After arriving there, her pregnancy not visible, she was further deported onto a subcamp of the Flossenburg concentration camp. By the time Priska went into labor, it was early April 1945. She gave birth on a table in the factory where the victims performed slave labor, surrounded by people who assisted her, even the supervisors of the commando who brought warm water to her. They took scraps of clothing and sewed together the dress that you see here. 2 days after the birth of her daughter, Hannah, Priska was then placed on a train with hundreds of others and moved to Mauthausen, concentration camp in Austria. The women around her helped her board the train while hiding her baby. She was liberated with her daughter Hannah in May of 1945. Born in 1893 in Tallinn, Estonia, Alfred Rosenberg became an early member of the Nazi Party, writing for its newspaper Volkische Beobachter starting in 1923. He was anti-communist, anti-Semitic. In 1940, he became head of the task force which plundered Jewish libraries and art from all over Nazi-occupied territories. And in 1941, he was Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories. In the second half of 1941, the territory administered by Rosenberg became the region where the mass murder of Jewish men, women, and children first became a systematic pattern and led to the final solution of the Jewish question, which was executed on a European scale. He kept a diary from 1934 to 1944, which you can see partially here on the left. On March 28, 1941, he wrote in the diary and referred to the opening conference of his brainchild, the Institute for Research into the Jewish Question. Quote, "I regard the conference as a success. It is, after all, the first time in European history that 10 European nations were represented at an anti-Jewish conference with a clear program to remove this race from Europe," unquote. Quote, "And now this perception of a historical necessity is backed up by force," unquote. This diary was located in the 1990s among a very large collection of records belonging to Robert Kempner, who was a US prosecutor during the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1946. After the trial, he returned to the United States with a large amount of evidence used at the trials, including the diary. Upon the transfer of Kempner's estate to the USHMM after his death, it was noted that the diary was missing. Ultimately, the USHMM hired a private investigator and worked with US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations, special agents to locate and transfer the diary to the museum. It took many, many years. The headphones seen at the right are from the collection of the IBM Corporation here in the United States. They created simultaneous translation for the trials themselves. This was the first time that this had ever been used with the establishment and help of IBM. They stored all their headphones worn by defendants at the trials in their headquarters and were located by USHMM staff for an early exhibition. The headphones here were worn by Rosenberg, as you can see in the photograph of him in the docket, and they are labeled with his name on them. In 1944, Elona Kellner was deported from Hungary to Auschwitz and then to a subcamp of Buchenwald, where the slave labor force worked with munitions. In the cards seen here, issued for Elona upon her arrival in Buchenwald, information such as her name, her birth date, that's included, but also her mother and father's name and their last addresses or homes, which in this case, Elona stated was Birkenau, the subcamp of Auschwitz. Her prisoner uniform number, which she saved after her liberation, is seen here and confirms the numbers on these prisoner cards. The Arlson Archive helped us to better understand Elona's history, but the artifacts seen here and what they bring to our collection can come only from what Elona has told her own family and then in turn us. Some 800 pieces of paper that Elona had squirreled off the floor of the munitions factory were used to record hundreds of recipes by not only herself, but fellow inmates at night in their barracks. The inmates would talk and she would transcribe, often writing the name of the person who provided the recipe. She was liberated and kept these papers with her, returning to communist Hungary, and later in the 1970s, ultimately came to the United States with these papers. Her daughter remembered her baking with these recipes while she was growing up. In 2018, Elona's daughter entrusted the USHMM with the collection and her mother's number. The USHMM, our curatorial staff also wants to be able to give our donors and subsequent generations something as well. We'd like to be able to provide information to people, to personal people who want to know information they never knew. With millions of microfilmed and digitized pages from all over Europe, Israel, North America, North Africa, Central and South America, the USHMM is one of the largest repositories in the world, enabling scholars and researchers to do their work in fewer archives. But our archives are also used by personal people who want information about their loved ones, who just have a greater desire to learn more. At the age of 18, Jadwiga Kuzio, who you can see here wearing the wreath on her head and the white dress, had been found as an infant wounded in an apartment after the liquidation of the ghetto of Brest-Litovsk, which is now Belarus, after the occupants had been deported. The only clue as to her true identity was where she was found and her surname Goldberg. In 2002, her daughter contacted the museum asking for assistance. Unable to gain access to archives in the very own city that her family lived in, they turned to the USHMM. Because the museum had microfilmed the Brest-Litovsk archives, my colleague not only found records for Fradla Goldberg's parents, but they had also revealed that her father and mother were medical professionals in the ghetto and had been forced to fill out these questionnaires, which you see at the left. This photograph of Jadwiga on the right at her first communion proves that Jadwiga was taken and raised as a Catholic, but now she knew who her parents were and she had photographs of them, which is even more important. Ross and Helen Baker were Americans living overseas in Vienna, Austria in 1937 and 1938. In March of 1938, when the Nazis marched into Austria, Ross captured the events on the camera that you see here, and Helen wrote about them in her diary, also seen here. Her entry of March 14th states there are flags all over town, even on our house, but not in the apartment where a Jew lives below, a Jewish doctor lives below. March 16th, 1938, papers are full of annexation of Austria, suicides, new laws, Jews trying to escape over the border, Jewish stores marked Jude. See the downstairs couple looking sad. Let's look at the film that Helen actually refers to that Ross Baker captured of these events.
American professor Ross Baker was on sabbatical studying chemistry in Vienna when the Nazi regime annexed Austria to Germany in March 1938. With his wife Helen and 3 of their sons, Baker went into the streets with a 16mm movie camera. Ross recorded the German propaganda that blanketed the city in an attempt to legitimize the takeover. The Germans dispatched high-ranking Nazis to give speeches, such as those advertised on the posters seen here, on topics like why I became an anti-Semite. Hitler greets jubilant crowds of Austrians, many of whom welcomed him with open arms. Ross Baker also filmed graffiti scrawled on Jewish shops. This vandalism happened as soon as the Nazis entered the country and was often perpetrated by the Austrians themselves. On April 25, 1938, Helen Baker wrote in her diary, "Ross comes home telling of seeing Nazis compelling an old Jew to paint Jude on his own store window. Can hardly wait to get away from here." Helen Baker continues in her diary, "Ross and I tour the inner city, see Judengasse with every shop shut tight." A crowd gathers outside the offices of the Jewish community that were raided and closed by the SS on the orders of Adolf Eichmann. In this rare bit of film, you see Helen Baker, dressed in a dark jacket and hat, attempting to enter a Jewish shop, only to be turned away by a Nazi. Jews line up at this building, seeking visas to leave the country.
We're very fortunate because it's very unusual to have pre-war film footage, but it's also, and wartime, it's very something that's very important to us because it comes from personal collections. And I think one of the things that people don't understand is the pre-war European film footage is very important to our collection. And it gives a greater depth and a better lens as to what life was like before and immediately before the Holocaust began. Switching over, I wanted to talk very briefly about the USHMM's loan programs. A lot of the material that we bring in is very valuable and inherent because it tells such a broad history of the Holocaust. And so we have an extremely active loan program. The purpose of the loan program is to help other museums and institutions educate the public on events surrounding the Holocaust and gain greater understanding of this time period. The museum makes every effort to consider each loan application and work with a borrowing partner. Once a loan is requested, each object or document goes through a conservation review and determines parameters for display, lighting, and length of loan. Let me show you a couple of examples of not only places we've loaned, but what we've loaned. So this is a drawing that was created by Elizabeth Koenig, whose family had to flee Paris in after the German invasion of France. And she captured everybody fleeing to the south in this drawing that you see here. And this recently was loaned to our partners, the Holocaust Museum in Houston, which actually just rebuilt and reopened their museum a year ago. Next, please. These are also two examples that are very unusual. We have on the left diary, not a diary, but a book that was written by a group of boys called the Nessarim, who were in Theresienstadt, and it survived with one of the boys who was liberated. And on the right, you have a student book carried by a Jewish student in pre-war Nazi Germany. And the thing that's so interesting is that on every page of the book is this yellow stripe because he was a Jewish student. Next. And diary seen here that was written during his time in hiding by Peter Feigle. The reason the diary for us is so important is because it gives you are reading his words of the time period. So you are getting a glimpse, a very much fuller story of what he's going through at the time period, as opposed to having him do an oral history afterwards. So the diaries in our collection are vital. And in this case, these were the only 2 pictures he had of his parents, which he posted in the diary. His parents were deported to Auschwitz, where they were murdered, and the diary survived the war. And these 2 pictures were the only pictures Peter had after the war. Next. And here you see an installation that is currently at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and it is on Auschwitz, and it's by an organization called Musealia. What happens often is that these organizations then move their exhibit from one museum to another. This was in Spain, this exhibition. Then it was in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, and its next venue is going to be in Kansas City, starting hopefully in June. And the mural that you see of all the people on the left are Nazis who are at Auschwitz relaxing, quote unquote. And we have an album called the Hooker album that shows Nazis who were taking a break very close, or sort of like a weekend break, very close to where the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau was located. Next. And here are some pages from that album, which is on loan there right now. And then this is from a Canadian museum, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. And we've loaned off and on repeatedly. What we do is they have a permanent exhibition, and we will loan artifacts to them, and then they'll need to rotate them. And so we've been working to keep artifacts in rotation for their purposes of their permanent exhibition. Next. And here I just wanted to throw out a list of some of the places that we've loaned. Some are very large institutions and some are small, but as you can see, we loan to a lot of organizations overseas, not only in this country. And then I wanted to talk briefly about where we are today, or where we were today. In October of 2020, the museum, during COVID, tried to reopen. We were open for 4 weeks. Here are a couple of pictures of the visitors walking through at the time period. We went down to a quarter of the amount of people that normally walk through the exhibition. And by November 22nd, it was clear that we couldn't stay open because of the uptick of COVID in our area. So unfortunately, we are now closed again. And we're hoping that while we are closed, that visitors will visit our website, and that also people will contact us. And while we are not physically accepting collections, we look forward to hearing from people who would like to discuss potential loans. And for more information on collections, we'll provide our email at the end of this program. And let me turn it over to my colleague, Jude Richter. Thank you so much, Jude.
Thank you very much, Susie. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Jude Richter, and I'm here to talk to you today about one of the most valuable resources for research on the fates of survivors and victims of the Holocaust, namely the ITS Digital Archive. Susie mentioned all the vast collections we have on microfilm and digital form that we're able to use to do research for survivors and their families and the families of victims. I'm going to focus on this one particular archive because of its size and how much we use it. And then I'm going to tell you about its origins, and then share with you some examples of the kinds of documents that the museum staff are able to provide to survivors and their families. During the late 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th, Red Cross wartime tracing efforts had focused on soldiers. The growing number of refugees in the years immediately prior to World War II, however, called attention to the need for tracing civilians. And this was going to go beyond anybody's imagination by the time the war was over. In 1943, the British Red Cross Service for International Affairs became a tracing service. In February of 1944, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force assumed control of this tracing effort. And in October 1945, the Central Tracing Bureau was transferred to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. In this photo, we see UNRWA staff sitting in front of a chalkboard with codes that were used to identify documents, by the camps that they came from. In 1947, the Central Tracing Bureau was taken over by the International Refugee Organization, and the following year, it was renamed the International Tracing Service. By this time, documents that liberators had found at concentration camps were being taken to Bad Arolsen, Germany. The town was centrally located between the 4 occupation zones in Germany, and its infrastructure had survived the war largely intact, so it was a good place to set up operations. Here we see a death book from Buchenwald open to deaths from June of 1943, and this is just 3 or 4 days maybe in June. And I don't know how much you could see on the screen there, but it lists people's first and last names, their prisoner numbers, dates of birth, and their dates and causes of death. Camp documents like these became an invaluable work for the International Tracing Service in their efforts to trace the fates of survivors and victims of the Holocaust. The International Tracing Service continued to operate until just a few years ago. It continues to operate now under a new name, the Arolsen Archive. So when you hear me talk about the International Tracing Service, that's an organization that has changed its name once again, but we sometimes will say ITS or Arolsen Archives interchangeably. In order to find individual names in the growing collection that the ITS created an index card for each name that appeared on each list. Each card provided additional information about the person that was found on the list, as well as information about the list itself. These cards were compiled in what is now known as the Central Name Index, or CNI. There's a card for each time a person's name appears on a document, and they're filed alphabetically using what's called a Soundex system, so that different spellings of the same names are mostly filed together. A name that starts with SCH or SZW or whatever will be filed together. You know, Schwartz has, I'm not even sure how many spellings, for example. I'm going to show you a CNI card in just a few minutes. Before I show you that, I want to give you a brief overview of what kind of documents are in the ITS Digital Archive. The collection has 200 million documents with information about 17.5 million people. And these people include Jewish survivors and victims of the Holocaust, as well as other victims of Nazi persecution who were taken to camps or prisons. Some people will appear on multiple documents, while others will not appear on any. Documentation is generally more thorough for people deported from Western Europe than those who lived in Poland or the former Soviet Union, for example. But even that is still worth doing a search. We might not have wartime documents for a survivor, but we may have post-war records about him or her. And in addition, after the war, people submitted requests for information about their family members who had died during the war. So even if we don't have wartime documentation about that person's fate, we might have a record of a request known as the Tracing and Documentation, or TD file, and those can have information that's of interest to family members. Now I want to turn back to this example of one of the Central Name Index cards we use to locate documents in the collection. And I'm going to share with you just a very small sampling of the kinds of documents that we have. This is a Central Name Index card for Ludwig Arnstein. It gives us his date and place of birth and tells us that he was from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. GCC2/1C or /IC/1 tells us where to find this particular document in the collection. The GCC2 is a signature that's applied to all the documents from Buchenwald, and IC and 1 tell us where within that section of the ITS Digital Archive the particular document will be found. This document is going to be a list which shows that Ludwig Arnstein was with a group of prisoners who arrived in the Buchenwald camp system from Auschwitz on October 10th, 1944. And this is the list itself, and Ludwig Arnstein's name is the first to appear at the very top of the list, which I did that on purpose because it's easy to say the first name. But lists like this could be just a page or two long, but sometimes a transport list might be 40 or more pages with 2,000 or 3,000 names on them. So clearly having each individual list index is a real advantage to us to be able to find the documents. Otherwise, it would be next to impossible. In addition to lists, we sometimes can find individual documents about prisoners at some of the camps. These camps in particular will include Buchenwald, Dachau, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, and a few others. Some for Auschwitz, but not as many as we would like. Some of those were lost. This is a prisoner card from Buchenwald to Ida Macher. It provides her basic social and demographic information about her, her date and place of birth, her marital status, where she lived. The bottom section, it's supposed to be information about punishments that were meted out on the prisoner, but instead there it shows her parents' names and her, I believe, her husband's name. And the second column tells us a little bit about her movement from one camp to another within the camp system. And the final column, which is not completed here and often isn't, sometimes is, provides information about her basic physical appearance, her height, would provide information about a prisoner's height or weight, how good their vision and hearing are, the color of their hair, any unique or identifying features, those kinds of things. The cards were printed in bulk, and one of the things that we sometimes see is that a card may have been completed for a prisoner, but there's little to no information except the basic identifying information. This is a personal effects card for Sevek Schmelzman, who was just 12 years old, or almost 12 years old, when he arrived in Buchenwald. The card itself lists all the different kinds of items, like articles of clothing a person might bring with himself or herself into a camp, but as we see here, little Sevek didn't have anything that he brought with him. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see Sevek's signature. And it's actually one of the things when we're working with, especially the children of survivors, that's one of the things that people will jump out at people. They recognize their parents' signature, they recognize their mother or father's handwriting. And it can be quite moving for the children of survivors to see that for the first time in a long time. In this particular case, I was struck just looking at this child's signature, thinking about a 12-year-old boy arriving in Buchenwald. If I remember correctly, he was with his father, so he was not alone, but still the horror of what this young boy must have seen. The next item is what's called a post-control card, which is designed to show incoming and outgoing mail for the prisoner named on the card. And these kinds of cards, again, we'll find in the records for many different camps. And what we usually will see is that Jewish prisoners never were allowed to receive or send out mail, but they still filled out and completed a card with the prisoner's name, date of birth, place of birth, prisoner number, etc. And this last wartime document I want to show you is what's called a sickbay card. Sickbay cards often include a very brief medical history of a prisoner. This card is again from Buchenwald. Then it includes a very brief medical history of the prisoner named on it. And on the back, it lists immunizations that the prisoner was given in the camp system. And we often will see this notation that you see on the back, the card in the lower right-hand corner. At the top of the card, it's a notation indicating that he had received 3 shots in a series to vaccinate prisoners against typhus, which some people wonder why they bothered to vaccinate prisoners when the goal was for the prisoners to die. And the answer to that is that the disease was just so contagious that it would easily go from the prisoners to camp officials, officers who worked at the camp. And so it was in the Nazis' best advantage to not let them get sick. Now I want to turn to a few examples of the post-war documentation we have. As I said earlier, we might not have wartime documentation for a prisoner depending on where they were during the Holocaust. This is especially the case for prisoners, not prisoners, excuse me, but for people who spent most or all of the war in hiding. There's no record usually of the fact that they were hiding. Any indication would have been created after the war. This is what's called an Allied Expeditionary Force DP registration record for Sonia Vavulitska. This card includes, again, basic social and demographic information about her parents' names, her date and place of birth, and where she wanted to immigrate. In this case, Palestine. This card was filled out in 1946 before the establishment of the state of Israel. So a lot of times we'll see Palestine written on these cards. On the back of the card is a place for a medical clearance certificate, which in this case was not filled out. When it is filled out, it usually will include information about vaccines that they've been given and any treatments they might have received during the post-war period in the hospitals for displaced persons that were run by UNRWA and other organizations. This is another identity card for Sonia Wawulitska from the United Nations. This has a lot less information, but what it does have is her photograph. And for me, again, just like the signature, as you can imagine, a photograph is even more precious to the family members of survivors. I've had on a couple occasions, the children, grandchildren of survivors tell us that this is the only photo of their grandparent that they have from before the war. I mean, excuse me, not from before the war, but from before they came to the United States or went to Israel or Canada or wherever they ended up going. So it's all the more meaningful to have that. We do sometimes occasionally find photographs in the records from the camps. As you can imagine, the prisoners, you can tell that they're in poor health or that they've lost a lot of weight or whatever. So this can be really distressing for family members. We always make sure to tell them that we're sharing a photograph from their time in the camp before we give it to them, so just so they can sort of prepare themselves for the shock of what they're going to see. Identity documents like this not only provide basic information about individual survivors, but they also provide their location at a particular moment in time. And if you have enough documents, you can put together sort of document a person's itinerary or whatever you'd like to call it during and after the war. Other documents created during the immediate post-war period provide more detailed information about individuals and families. This is the cover of what is called a CM1 or care and maintenance file. A CM1 file is a kind of case file that contains documentation about an individual or family's efforts to obtain various kinds of assistance from relief organizations after the war. CM1 files usually contain a person or family's application for assistance from the Preparatory Committee of the International Refugee Organization. The first page seen here lists the head of the family and any other family members. And in this particular case, it was just a single person, Adolf Mulstein. At the bottom, it lists where he was during the past 10 years. And this was important for making sure that Nazis and collaborators were not somehow gaining assistance, and just so that they could, again, for tracing purposes and that sort of thing. The next 2 pages include additional information following on where the location for the past 10 years. It also lists the last 10 years of employment, their educational attainment, any languages they speak, other families elsewhere, especially outside of Europe, that might be able to sponsor them if they wanted to immigrate, and other sources of assistance. The last 2 pages on this form include information about a person's membership in different organizations. In this case, Adolf Mulstein had been a member of Pol Zion, which was a socialist Zionist party. The page also lists his current address, and there's a place for notes about the individual survivor or the family of survivors. Sometimes these files are much more extensive. You will see, the beginning of the file, it might have a married couple and 1 child, and then there'll be addenda to the file if a second child was born while the family was still under the care of the International Refugee Organization. Sometimes there'll be medical records, again, photographs. I once was able to give a young man a file that had photographs of both of his grandparents, as well as all of their children. He was just delighted to be able to have that because, again, nobody in their family had photos like that. We see in the left-hand side of the page, there's a notation indicating that Adolf Molstein was indeed determined eligible to receive assistance from the IR, the International Refugee Organization. So there were different kinds of assistance they provided, including protection from persecution. Many of those who found themselves in displaced persons camps after the war eventually made their way to the United States, Israel, or elsewhere to try to start new lives for themselves and their families. So one of the things, again, people are most interested in when they come to us is finding out when, what ship, what date their parents arrived in the US, for example. We might not be able to tell them from our records when they arrived, but we can tell them what ship and when they left Europe, which they can then figure that out from other sources that are available via commercial websites and things like that. The collection has lots of documents, other documents related to immigration, but passenger lists are some of the most extensive ones that we have. So that covers, I think, a lot of, a very basic overview of what we have in the collection. And now I think I'm going to hand this back to Jaime so he can handle questions and answers from all y'all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jude. A very, very impressive presentation, both of you, Susie and Jude. And for our audience, that they can imagine, this is a little bit of complex. The research component is a little bit of complex when it comes to do this type of research. But our colleagues at the museum are experts, and they can, with minimal information, they can develop a whole information or what we call a case for you, and really find a lot of information about your family. We're going to go to the Q&A component. I see several questions that the audience has shared with us. One says, what type of items the museum most want? It is a statutory declaration to sponsor an orphan from the UNRWA camp, something that will be desired. I will send that question to Susie, who probably can answer that. And also there's another question related for Susie also can answer is, does the museum only collect materials that it plans to use for an exhibition?
Thank you. Well, first of all, we do have a pretty wide collections mandate that includes pre-war life in Europe, anything from occupation and the displaced persons era. So yes, the person who has, I'm not sure if you understood it correctly, a statue from an UNRWA camp. If that's the case, definitely, I would like to talk to you about it, send a picture. We have a very wide collecting mandate. So we want to show pre-war life and what life was like before people were deported or before people had to uproot their lives and flee to any number of places, not only the United States, but to Shanghai, China, or to Central or South America, maybe to, Australia. I mean, this is all very important. And we don't only collect, in fact, we don't collect for just exhibition. We have a full schedule of seminars during the year when we're not bogged down with COVID. We have scholars and researchers who access our collection in person all the time. And we are digitizing more and more of our collection so that it is online for scholarship. It's really important that your individual museum, the museum will take your individual stories and they will catalog the collection, because every story is different. Every history is different. So we want to be able to tell as many historical, have as many historical examples as possible.
Thank you there. Thank you, Susie. There are a few more questions here. This one that perhaps Jude can answer is to schedule a research service, do we have to come to the museum when it opens?
No, the ones that we're scheduling for this week, we're going to be doing online via Zoom. And then in addition to that, we have an online request reform at our website. I don't have the website on the top of my head, but I think it'll go out in some of the follow-up email that you'll be getting from us, that you can fill in a research form online, and then we will do that research for you and send it to you. The advantage of meeting with us one-on-one during this coming week is that we'll get to talk to you a little bit more and learn a little bit more about what kind of records you're looking for, who in your family, whose documents you'd like us to find. And we probably will be able to get those documents to you a little bit more quickly than we would if you went through our regular research request process.
Another one related to ITS, Jude, is how do we go about searching the ITS for the records of a family member who was at a DP camp?
Again, you could submit the request to us. Some of the documents are online via the Arrowson Archives website, for example, but not all of them are available online at this time. There also, some of them are, might be able to find through our Holocaust Survivors and Victims database that the museum has, but again, those are not complete. My suggestion would be, once you've looked at those, you should still come to us and be able to look and see what you could find, what we can find in the ITS digital archive, and again, as well as in other collections we have that might be relevant to what you're looking for.
Another common question from someone from New Jersey. He or she collects documents related to World War II, Shoah, and possesses several very rare escape document, visiting documents, and perpetrators document. I would like to share the images of those you are interested in. What should?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are very interested as well in showing documentation on perpetration to help us better understand the time period leading up to and during the Holocaust. And again, you'll have information at the end of the program, but we have a very easy email. It's curator@ushmm.org, and that'll be provided. But yes, I mean, it's interesting because people do question why we accept perpetrator material. We don't accept Nazi memorabilia, but we want to know. Documentation helps us to really, the research is important for us and the aspect of it. And since Jude is a researcher, he can also, I would ask you to also respond to why it's important.
To collect Nazi era documentation?
Yes.
Well, many of the documents that I use every day were created by the Nazis, first of all, to document the fates of survivors and victims, but also, we have at the museum the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, where people from all over the world come every year, except the past year, although they are here more or less remotely, to study various aspects of Nazism and the Holocaust. And sometimes things that a museum isn't, we think of the museum as a memorial and it's what we want to remember, but we also collect the things that are things we don't want to honor with commemorating, but they're still valuable to historians and other scholars who are trying to understand how is it that this happened. There's like the moral aspect of the question, but also the technical aspect. How were these operations carried out? Who made these decisions? Those kinds of things can be really valuable for scholars working on those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because going back to the Rosenberg diary, Alfred Rosenberg diary, he describes like a lot of the pettiness and infighting within the higher Nazi party. And it's actually fascinating to read. It's fascinating to understand where his thought process was. it's, you know, to me, I have found that the reading the translation of the diary has been interesting.
We have a few more questions and we have a few more minutes. So there's one here. Can you describe accessibility to families who donate to the collection? Are you able to locate and research pre-war birth records in Eastern Europe? That's probably for both of you, actually.
I could take the second part. We, as a general rule, aren't able to locate and research pre-war birth records in Eastern Europe. However, we can tell you where to look if you get in touch with us. We have a very, very small number of metrical books from the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that were created before World War I. And sometimes they'll even go up into the 30s or 40s. And those were the books and I know more about how this worked in the Russian Empire than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but I think they were similar, that in the Russian Empire, religious clergy of different faiths, starting with the Orthodox Christians, but then other Christian faiths, and then later Muslims and Jews, were required to record the births, deaths, and marriages of the people in their particular communities. And so we have a very, 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 like, I'm afraid of being flooded with requests for these because we only have a small handful of them, but we can tell you where you can find, where the resources are available to find more. And there's a website for, by a woman named Miriam Weiner, I think, and it's called Roots to Roots. So that's Roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, to Roots, R-O-O-T-S. And if you look at that, there'll be information on what archives in I think Poland, Ukraine, and Russia will have records available. That's a good place to start if that falls within where your family's from.
And let me just, from what I understand of the question, can families access their collections? I'm assuming you mean once the collection is donated. Yes, families can always access their collections. It's not only families. Anyone that wants access to the collection can have access to the collection. If the collection happens to be not in great shape, sometimes we'll limit that, but never to a family. A family and their subsequent generations can always visit a collection. We just ask that you give us a week to 10 days notice because we house our collections off-site. So unless you can come directly to off-site, which we do allow, we just bring the collection to the museum.
That, of course, is when we open.
When we're open, right?
We're open sometimes.
When we're in a perfect world.
Exactly, in the near future. Unfortunately, we are, the program has to come to an end. We're running out of time. It's almost 2 o'clock. And before we end, I would like to thank the Generations After organization, my colleagues, Susie Snyder and Jude Richter, for their informative presentations, and the museum team behind the scene who helped bring this program to you. And of course, to you, the audience, for participating. After the program, you will receive a survey questionnaire, and we will appreciate it if you can complete it and send it back to us with your comments. Also, if you would like to make an appointment with our curators and/or researchers, and you have not requested yet, you will have that option on the survey. This is a special opportunity we are offering to program participants this week. There were a few more questions that we will try to get to them and answer to you via email, so stay tuned. Again, thank you all for participating. Be well and stay safe. Goodbye.